Great. Welcome everyone. I'm so delighted today to have this event and have it with Professor John Lewis Gaddis tonight, who I'm sure many of you, needs no introduction at all. We've studied him in our history classes. He's been hailed as the Dean of Cold War Historians, and he's the Robert A. Lovett Professor of Military and Naval History at Yale, where he's taught the studies in Grand Strategy course for the past 16 years alongside Paul Kennedy and Charles Hill. Also in 2012, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of George F. Kennan, An American Life. And his latest book, On Grand Strategy, was published in 2018. With that said, thank you very much, Professor Gaddis, for joining us tonight. We're all very much looking forward to hearing you present tonight. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you all. I also like to think of myself as a former Oxford Don for having spent a couple of years there, one year as Harmsworth Professor and 1 year as Eastman Professor. But that was a long time ago. Probably none of you were born at that point. So let me just start with what Mitch has invited me to do, which is to make some comments about the topic for today, which is Trump as history. I really intend these simply to get a discussion going. And so I will be deliberately outrageous and provocative in what I have to say. And then we'll see where that takes us. So just to begin, he's gone, and that's a great relief. The evil genius, the fearsome monster, the bumbling clown, the nasty kid, whatever you think he was, he's gone. But the question is, and this is what historians are going to have to wrestle with, is how could he have happened in the first place? And I think that requires, appropriately enough for our medium today, some zooming in and some zooming out. So let me zoom in from several big points. One is global, that is the breakdown, what I'm sure to be the breakdown of globalization, and the not unrelated revival of authoritarianism that has happened, perhaps as a result of that. Within the United States, certainly, and in some other countries as well. Second issue, the rise of inequality and the consequent diminishing of expectations, which certainly for Americans is an unusual situation to be in. In terms of American domestic politics, the failure of both political parties in 2016 to produce plausible candidates. They had to work very hard to come up with as unpleasant and as implausible set of candidates as they came up with in 2016. So something's wrong with the nominating process. At the technological level, it seems to me the simultaneous proliferation of social media, with which you're all familiar, and the resulting degradation of political and public discourse, which you may be concerned with, as I certainly am. Finally, just a personal biographical consideration, and this is Trump's candidacy, which I think originated as a prank, as a lark. I don't think he was serious about it in the first place. I don't think he expected to win. I think he was surprised and unprepared when he did win, but he found that he liked power too much to give it up and just go play golf. And indeed, he discovered that he could have power and still play golf, and he played a lot of it along the way. So it was a comfortable situation for him. And so what happened, basically, I think historians are going to say, is that a parody morphed into a paradigm. And that's kind of an unusual situation. It's going to be fun to write about that, I think, after we get a sense of an aesthetic detachment from the trauma of these events. But that may take a little while to get to that point. Looking at this as a parody morphing into a paradigm explains several things, I think. It helps to explain why neither the political establishment or the media or the other candidates took Trump seriously, because how could they, since he didn't take himself seriously, I think, at least in the initial stages of this. It helps to, I think, explain why once he became president, his appointments were so volatile. Not knowing what to do, he did not know who to appoint to these positions. And that took him quite a long time to figure out. In some cases, he never quite figured it out. it helps to explain why, in turn, the myth of the deep state got started. With that kind of turnover in the government among his advisors, a lot of people thought there had to be a conspiracy. There had to be some form of organized resistance embedded deep within the bureaucratic structure, perhaps operated out of a pizza parlor somewhere in suburban Washington, that was causing all of this to happen. And the culmination of all of this was what we now must come to call 9/6. You know about 9/11, 9/11, sorry, 1/6. I'm still getting used to this. January 6th, the date the Visigoths, who took literally what Trump may have meant only metaphorically, finally took and assaulted the Capitol. Having done so, however, like some other barbarians in the past, they didn't quite know what to do with it. And so they slunk away shamefacedly, dragging their spears and their horned helmets and their bear spray with them. So that's how the parody worked, it seems to me. And perhaps in the light of all of this, there was a certain predictability to these events. Could Trump have become a dictator? This is one of the things I hope we'll be able to talk about later in the discussion. My own view is no, I don't think so. And I think the reason was because of Trump's extraordinary Twitter transparency. If you think about this, authoritarians in the past and some in the present, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Putin, Xi, and their smaller siblings, have all tended to have agendas of one kind or another. Having done this, they know that they will then do that, and so on. They have a plan, they have a strategy. But they don't reveal these agendas or plans at the moment that they've thought them up. They don't just have a light bulb moment and then go public with it. They keep it much more close to the vest. They plot, but they don't tweet, and that's a big difference. Trump tweeted, and what he thought became perfectly transparent to everybody who was following his tweets as soon as he'd had the thought, because there could be hundreds of tweets in one day even. And this is a completely unprecedented stream of consciousness form of leadership, which I think is inconsistent with being a dictator in the first place. Trump went cold turkey on tweeting only when forced to, when Twitter and Facebook turned him off. And of course, it's revealing that he hasn't been heard much from since then. He depended on that. So what is his legacy? I think it's clear that it was not that of a builder. It was more that of a destroyer. What gets more complicated, though, is that sometimes in order to build, you have to destroy. Maybe if you're building an impressive building somewhere, you have to clear the lot before you do it. Maybe if you're trying to come up with a new paradigm, a new theory, you have to undermine the previous one in order to do it. And we know from economists, capitalism can have its creative destructions without which innovation doesn't take place. But there's a larger pattern to this too. You could argue, some historians do, that without a civil war, slavery in America might never have been abolished. That without the Great Depression, the New Deal might not have come forward. That without Pearl Harbor, the United States might have stayed out of World War II altogether. That without the Kennedy assassination, Johnson could never have launched the Great Society with the success that he had. And of course, without the flame out of Reagan's movie career, he might never have had a chance to end the Cold War. So you can see that there are connections between some of these events, even in fairly big ways. So the question I want to raise with you and propose for discussion is whether Trumpist destruction will come to be seen as having had over the long term some constructive consequences. And I'd like to suggest just a few places where that may be the case. If it is, it seems to me it's most likely to come in the area of breaking up what I would call pockets of policy stagnation, otherwise known as blobs. Mitch, I think, studies Soviet history, and so he will know about eras of stagnation. But there are eras of stagnation in other periods and other countries, for sure, and on smaller scales than that one. And I think blobs, as we now understand that term, are pretty much that. It's conventional wisdom. It's everybody taking for granted a certain policy, and then it becomes encrusted with precedent, procedure, and so on. And it's very hard to reconsider it. So one such blob, in my opinion, was this myth of globalization, this idea that globalization was going to lift all boats and was going to democratize all societies, or at least most. And even in the face of evidence that this was not happening, that blob hung on, really, I think, through the end of the Obama administration. And in some universities, it hangs on even today with the prevalence of globalization studies, as if globalization is the wave of the future. I think it's likely just the opposite in this regard. The second kind of blob would be the idea coming from this, that everybody benefits from government action equally, but ignoring the evidence of social and economic inequality that had developed inside this country over the last quarter century or so. For Americans, if not for other people, this idea of diminishing expectations is almost an unprecedented phenomenon, because throughout American history, expectations have credibly risen, not fallen. And yet that is now happening on a very large scale. And yet this had not filtered through to the political processes in this country until Trump took advantage of this issue and exploited it. So he saw things in that way that nobody else really was seeing or thinking about. Another such blob is just assuming an absence of limitations on what we can do. We can take as many immigrants as want to come into the country. We can fight as many unending wars as may be necessary to regain or to maintain credibility in the world. And we can continue to rely on the invulnerability that we accustomed ourselves to, first in our period of isolationism, long period of isolationism, and then later the invulnerabilities that we built through the deterrence structures of the Cold War. But I think these themselves are blobs in some way, because there are limits to all of these things. And this was an area where the Trump administration was at least noticing, if not acting, in a coherent manner. They were the first to begin to talk about some of these things in a serious way. Another such blob is diplomatic stalemates, just situations in which conventional wisdom, generally because regions, policy for regions is set by regional specialists, and regional specialists generally do not have a wider view. So blobs can develop in this area as well. And a classic example was the Middle East Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and Trump's surprising breakthrough, excuse me, the Abraham Accords, which young Jared really pulled off. And this was completely unexpected, but is now, I think, almost universally acknowledged to have been a significant achievement. And then finally, Trump has to some extent desanctified alliances which we were very skeptical about through most of our history, then became almost sacrosanct in the Cold War, to the point that the purposes of the alliance would often be lost sight of, and the alliances would become means in themselves, not means toward an end. NATO was a very good example of that. So when the Cold War ended, which NATO had been meant to avoid or keep the Cold War from going into a hot war, NATO survived and expanded, which is not what you would expect when that situation changed. And so on, this stagnation with regard to alliances, nobody wants to upset them. And Trump at least was questioning what their purposes were. And I think that may be a healthy process, even as you would acknowledge, as I think anybody would, you do need allies. But then, of course, there were with Trump also many minuses, most of which circle around to, I would just say, unnecessary frightening of those who would be our friends, and therefore undermining coalitions against those who are likely to be our enemies. And there are a couple of military principles here which apply. One is one that was popular when I used to teach at the Naval War College, which was don't take on any more enemies than you need at any one time. And this is something Trump did. And another one, which I ran into some years ago at West Point on a rainy day, and I raised an umbrella. And one of the Army officers in full uniform said, "Put that away." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Army officers are never seen with umbrellas." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it spooks the horses." And something like that, I think, is what Trump was doing. He was spooking the people who could have been helpful and were prepared to be helpful to us. And that was, it seems to me, unnecessary. So just to wind up this discussion, where does all of this lead us? And particularly, is the pandemic one of these great, without which crises, which could lead to creative opportunities in the long run? Great dangers, admittedly, but possibly great opportunities as well. One thing that's happening, and I'm sure you've noticed this in the UK as we have here, is a revival of the notion that governments do have a responsibility for the social and economic and physical well-being of their citizens. And the Reagan era of self-reliance, this notion that deficits put a limit on how much you could do in this area. This now seems obviously to have gone by the board. And despite the recent votes in Congress on the Biden aid bill, it's a bipartisan consensus because deficits were being ignored as much in the Trump administration as is happening with Biden. So I think that's an area for consensus and an interesting shift, almost in, not quite in the tectonics, but close to it. The second one, which is somewhat less clear, is, I think, the realization that no one power can dominate or manage the world, in contrast to, and no one institution either, in contrast to the view that that could be a credible danger in the early Cold War, and that it was an absolute necessity in the post-Cold War period that we serve in that management role. I think we're well on the way to seeing that proven impossible and to a multipolar world order, not an institutionally based world order, but a multipolar world order based on some of the classic models of multipolar systems as existed, for example, in the 19th century or in the 18th century. And one of the premises of that, of course, is that you seek order without attempting to seek sameness, without attempting to seek domestic compatibility. So you pay much less attention to whether you can democratize other countries and simply pay attention to the question of how you can get along with other countries, even if they are not democracies. And it seems to me that's definitely the direction that we're pointing in at this point. Yet another one, still related to the pandemic, has to do with the need for masks. And in this case, I don't mean just as a safeguard against viruses affecting bodies, but I mean it also as a safeguard against viruses afflicting minds. And here I'm back to the need to regulate social media, which even Facebook now, in the ads it's been taking out, at least in the New York Times recently, tends to endorse. The time has come, these ads say, in which we, Facebook, have to accept regulation. And that's an interesting development. I think it is certainly the case. This is a big change. Regulation of social media. But I think just as that's happening, there has to be something else that happens as well. And that is the fostering of an intellectual climate that's open to a wider range of political views. And here I'm talking about political incorrectness and the extent to which this is closing minds in so many universities, particularly, certainly in my own, for sure. So how do we balance this kind of thing, the need for free dialogue, open dialogue, with the need for the control of social media, with the fostering of unpopular points of view and still making those safe? How do we balance these kinds of things? And I think that's where the analogy of masks actually comes in, and this is where I want to wind up, because masks make breathing safe, and that means filtering out viruses, but not filtering out oxygen as we're doing it. And I think that's what we need, is something like that, a kind of compromise like that. Is it unreasonable? I don't think so, because when has life as we know it not depended on that? Let me stop with that. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Gaddis. We already have a couple of questions coming through on the chat, but if you don't mind, I'll take the moderator's privilege of asking a quick question, if that's okay with you. So you touched upon Trump's foreign policy successes, or at least partial successes in the Middle East. And I wondered your thoughts on Trump's foreign policy in other areas. So, for example, the Serbia-Kosovo normalization. And there was also a piece in the Washington Post which claimed that the administration did have a China strategy, so to speak. It was just that the president chose to ignore it. And again, on that, he claims to have, led the way in ensuring that Huawei was kicked out of the UK, Sweden, a host of other Western nations. So I wondered your thoughts on whether we can categorize these as successes or whether they're kind of more bluster. And also, secondly, just out of interest, whether you'd read any of the exposés, i.e. The Room Where It Happened or A Higher Loyalty, and if so, your thoughts on those before I take the questions from the chat, if that's okay.
Okay, that's a lot to discuss. I would just say that I don't mean to say that the successes outweigh the failures, but I do mean to say there are some successes that I think successes in the terms which that they will not be reversed by the Biden administration. That, for the moment, is my definition of success. So, for example, this would be the Abraham Accords. It would be our approach to China. It would be maintaining the tariffs for the moment on China. It would mean trying to keep Huawei out of 5G and that kind of thing. And so it won't be a total reversal of everything that the Trump administration has done. And I think that's perfectly natural. This is what happens even with transitions from one administration to another that's enormously different in its ideological tone. Things happen, history moves on, to coin a phrase. So that's why I think it's a mixed bag in that regard.
Great, thank you very much. We have, I have a question from Holly, who's an MSc student in international history, and would like to know, Professor Gaddis, whether you think that some of the blobs that you mentioned and that the Trump administration identified and tried to remove will return under the current president and the current administration, perhaps as he tries to distinguish himself, from his predecessor, whether those are prone to return at all.
I think it's entirely possible. And one possible area for this might be Iran and the revival of the negotiations leading to reviving the joint agreement on weapons with Iran. Because some of the same people who negotiated that agreement secretly in the Obama administration are now in high places in the Biden administration. I hope there will be some learning about that. I hope that there will be some skepticism about the other part of that bargain, which would that Iran would behave differently toward the rest of the world. And but I'm just not sure on that one. The other one, the other really big one, which I think is the most dangerous one of all, is Taiwan, for which there seems to be no good solution. Because we are very rapidly getting into a situation where our military capability to defend Taiwan is zilch. We're probably there now. I would call your attention to the new future war novel by Admiral Jim Stavridis. The title is 2034. And he's a former SACEUR. And he has written a novel just talking about how controversies over the South China Sea and over the defense of Taiwan could escalate into attacks that would completely wipe out the US Navy in the Pacific on a scale not seen since World War II. And this is plausible technology, if not immediately, then on the immediate horizon. So the question comes up, however praiseworthy your intentions are with a country like Taiwan, which is admirable in its achievements, showing that a Chinese culture can be democratic. On the other hand, if its position is indefensible, and if it becomes a trigger for, in effect, a global war, how do you deal with that? How do you square that circle? What happens? What compromises do you make? And to assume that we can defend everything that we were in a position to defend at the end of World War II, or in the Korean War, for example, or even in the Vietnam War, is, I think, ignoring what is happening in China and the fundamental shift in the military positions of the great powers. I don't have an easy answer for that one, but I don't think policy at that level and with these kinds of things has ever been easy. There have been these anguishing dilemmas. As the great Oxford Don Isaiah Berlin pointed out repeatedly in his writings, anguishing dilemmas are riddled all the way through history and life. You are always balancing incompatible good things. And this is a classic example of that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor. So we have a couple of hands up, so I'll go in the order that's on my screen. Timothy, if I ask you to unmute, and hopefully that works.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Firstly, Professor, thank you for coming to speak with us today. My first question would be regarding the history of the 4 years of the Trump years within the Republican Party themselves. Of course, at the moment, although he's without social media, Trump has demonstrated he still wants or still has the potential to almost hold a balance of power within the Republican Party through his own interventions in that way. I was wondering, do you think it's possible to envisage a form of Trumpism without Trump? By which I mean, is it envisionable as such to imagine a more conventional politician, perhaps one who's less able to or desiring to, stress norms, adopting things such as cultural and economic nationalism in a way that Trump did, whilst also combining them with a more establishment personality? Or do you think that Trumpism is, by its very inherent nature, it has to be populist, it has to be the sort of ideology that would support, for instance, the actions on the 6th of January? And I can imagine that to be something of a hot political issue as to whether that will be justified in future years or that will be something that's kind of skirted around. And a second question, if I might, I very much enjoyed your recent book on grand strategy. And just very quickly, I would wonder if you could give quite a pithy answer to whether you think Trump would be better described in retrospect as more of a fox or more of a hedgehog. Thanks very much.
Good question. Well, to your first one, Timothy, I have a cowardly answer, I'm afraid, which is that I hope that there will be an alternative within the Republican Party, but I'm not at all confident of this. And this is an artifact of how we have wrapped ourselves around several different unpleasant axles with the primary as the nominating structure for presidential candidates. And that's an example of good intentions gone awry. The old idea that big city bosses would pick out our party nominees was considered to be completely unjust and unfair and corrupt. And so we went to this wonderful idea of party primaries, which has proven to be, if not corrupt, certainly distorting in forcing these kinds of artificial positions on candidates who know perfectly well that these are impossible positions, but they feel they have to say this when they're lined up in that beauty contest that we have, and that's all absurd. I really wish we could go back to some stronger party discipline, which from time to time the UK has, but I'm not going to get into a discussion of that, in picking our candidates, because it seems to me this thing of Republicans being terrified to go against Trump is really quite absurd. I think, I hope that as time goes on, this will wear off. And as it becomes evident that Trump is not going to run again, he may run again. I don't think he'll be elected. Then the question comes, will this have an effect, and will it let younger people emerge? I don't know the answer to it. It may take a while. It took the Republican Party quite a long time to recover, for example, from Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. It took about 20 years, for that to happen. So it could be a long time, for sure. Sorry, your other question was?
Oh, sorry, it was just very quickly, whether you would consider Trump to be more of a fox or a hedgehog.
Ah, yes, okay. Not a fox, because fox is calculated. So I would say a hedgehog in the sense that he had one big idea, which was me. He would do whatever was necessary to promote himself, and that was it. And everything revolved around that, everything revolved around him. So it seems to me that that's a kind of self-centered hedgehog view. It's different from most hedgehogs in the classic portrayal of them. But the idea of a hedgehog having one big idea, and if the one big idea is me, then I think it fits.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Great. I'll hand over to Manas, who has a question.
Thanks so much, Mitch. Professor, I think there's one issue that is most definitely only going to become more relevant the further away we get from Trump, and I think that's climate change. And certainly it's one that we young people care about a lot. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on how Trump will go down in the history books on the issue of climate change, and I think most importantly, in what way he'll stand out from his predecessors on that issue.
Well, I'm worried that he will not stand out from his predecessors as much as one might hope, because it seems to me that this is an issue that obviously has not been adequately addressed by any recent American president, as far as that goes. Certainly Trump's position on this was pretty much oblivious and regressive in some sense of the word, So I think that we cannot hold out hope that the Trump administration will be regarded positively by historians who see the damage wreaked by climate change 40 or 50 years into the future. I do think that there are interesting things that are going on, obviously. One is what's happening to electric vehicles. And I guess we can thank Elon Musk for this and Tesla. But that is taking off, and that's pretty impressive, what's happening. Not because any politician did it, but because an entrepreneur has chosen to do it. Something like the same thing is happening with wind power, which has become economically a lot more viable than it once was, for reasons of profit. I think it's going to happen. It's going to happen in this way, that it will be the private sector that will come to see more quickly than the political sector will the need to respond to climate change. And it seems to me it's even reasonable to think that the big energy companies in time will see this. Some are already beginning to see it. So that's where I look for innovative developments. There's a similar issue coming up in the next age of space, because whereas space was something that governments got into back in the middle of the 20th century, now again it's the private sector that is doing this, at least in America and some other countries as well. And they can do it cheaper, they can do it faster, and so we're on the verge of a very exciting age of moon and even more significantly Mars exploration. all of which will be coming, or almost all of which will be coming from the private sector. That's the genius of capitalism. One of the areas, at least theoretically, it should be the genius of capitalism. And the real question is what that means in terms of competition with the Chinese, because the Chinese, of course, are capitalists, but they are also authoritarian while calling themselves communist, which is an interesting combination. And there are a lot of strains in those three things. Trying to triangulate that triangle is increasingly difficult, it seems to me. And I suspect what's going to happen is that what we'll give is capitalism. What we'll give is the initiative of businessmen in the self-regulated market as opposed to the imposed command market and economy. And that'll be one to watch for the future, because I suspect our system is better adapted to this kind of innovation than theirs is once they begin to phase out or try to control the admittedly deeply rooted Chinese instinct for entrepreneurial activity, innovation. Sorry, long answer.
Thank you very much, Professor. Hannah has a question next, if that's okay. So should hopefully be unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our Professor Zubok speaks very highly of you. So my question is, would it be right to describe Trump's foreign policy as a seismic shift?
No, I don't think so. It seemed seismic at the time. But I think instead, right now, we're just seeing it as a burp, not a seismic shift. Some people would say a fart, but I don't want to go to that extreme. I think it's going to be a blip. And the seismic shifts that are there are more deeply rooted. They preceded Trump. Some of them I talked about, but I don't think Trump created them in that particular sense. So no, I don't see him as a fundamental shifter, for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And following on from that, we had a question in the chat as to how, if at all, can the current administration, and you touched upon this earlier, Professor, mend relations with its first world allies in NATO, as well as close allies in the G7, after the position that Trump left those relationships in? And is there a way that the United States can regain its leverage to bargain with the other major powers after Trump, to quote, rocked the boat so vigorously?
I think that's easy, Mitch. I think it's, you take those scenes from old horror movies, he's back, and then project this, the Americans are back like this. But the result of this is not going to be horror. It's going to be delight. It's going to be enthusiasm. I think it's already happening. Trump was so upsetting to our allies. He was so unfathomable and unpredictable that it seems to me we are facing in alliance relationships a whole number of doors that are wide open. And I think in this situation, for the moment, people are very happy to have the Americans back. And that may not be the case indefinitely in the future, but I think it's not a great problem now. And Biden is certainly working on this for sure.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Adith has his hand up, so I'll hand over.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for holding this presentation. I really enjoyed your work for some time, so I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have a question. This is going back some time, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time. So you wrote an article in 1992 on Cold War and international relations theory, and you point out that one of the kind of shortcomings of Cold War historians and international relations theorists in foreseeing the end of the Cold War was that they overlook the function of time itself as a force in international politics. So I was curious there, you kind of drew this corollary at the beginning with kind of the breakdown of globalization as a universal force for good in academia. And I was curious, A, generally what you thought the function of time in general was in shaping history and global politics, and B, do you think that time itself has played a role in the breakdown of globalization more generally?
Well, first of all, that long ago article in 1992 was a really good, well-intentioned effort on my part to create dialogue with the political scientists. It actually had the opposite effect, and no political scientist has talked to me since that article came out, just with a complete break in relations. But the point I was trying to make in that article, and also in the book Landscape of History, which grew out of the last set of lectures I did in Oxford, is simply that history is a science. It's just not a predictive science. It's not a laboratory science. And I was making the point that the theorists of international relations are seeking to build theories for the purpose of predicting the future. And so that means they have to simplify. It means they have to focus on quantifiable things that are happening. It means they suffer from physics envy. So they focus narrower and narrower and say things that are more and more platitudinous, and therefore fail completely to predict the future. And that was my point about the Cold War and the theorists. But not all sciences are this way. So there's a whole group of sciences that are historical. And this would be, for example, astrophysics, looking at the Big Bang. It would be evolutionary biology. It would be geology. It would be paleontology. It would be medicine, in which history is important. The passage of time is absolutely definitive in causing things to happen. But the problem is, it's not, time passes, that much is predictable. But what time produces is not predictable. Because there are so many variables in the system. And so as the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote, and famously in some of his books, if you could go back and rerun evolutionary biology, you would not get anything like what we have today. It could have gone in millions of other directions or paths or whatnot. Both of them are sciences. And I think historians really ought to take this into account more seriously, and I think they'd feel better about themselves if they did so. But I got nowhere with the political scientists on this argument.
And Ella Denton has a question, if I unmute now.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for talking to us. I'm such a huge fan of yours. And I wanted to ask I don't know whether it's worth getting into kind of counterfactuals here, but I think for a while before the pandemic, it was looking like Trump had the upper hand. And I would ask, do you think that without the pandemic, Trump stood a real strong chance of winning the election?
Yes, I do. And that's because the Democrats, for all of the anguish that they have gone through, still have not completely diagnosed the state of the country. And one of the things that was surprising about the election last November is that the Democrats did not do better. They did have the pandemic working for them, obviously, but they only barely won control of the House of Representatives, and then tied in the Senate, and then won the special elections in Georgia that gave them their tiny majority in that regard. And one of the most revealing things that happened in the election is that the Mexican-American or Latino population of South Texas, very close to where I come from, voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And these are people that are right along the border, and you would have thought would have been resisting immigration because of its threat to their jobs and whatnot. But no, they were more concerned with the other threats to their jobs, their irrelevance in the new technological economy, their neglect by the centers of power on the East Coast and the West Coast, their feeling of being patronized by elites. And so they voted for Trump. And that's something the Democratic Party missed totally. So it could easily have lost the 2020 election for this reason. And if it cannot pay greater attention to these forces that are happening, to its traditional constituencies, but also to how they're changing. The traditional constituencies do not remain traditional over periods of time. Then they may well lose in 2022 and in 24. I still think it's unlikely that the Republicans would be so foolish as to nominate or renominate Trump in 24. But nonetheless, Republicans could certainly win in either of those elections coming up. So there's a lot of work to be done in the Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Ed Unwin, you should be able to unmute now. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I was just wondering, obviously it can be difficult sometimes to decide when the Cold War started between America and the Soviet Union. My question would be, do you think we are entering a Cold War with China? And if so, when do you think you'd say that started?
Well, I have a little bit of trouble with this term Cold War. It's, I like to say there's the Cold War with capital letters, which is roughly what happened sometime between the time it began, which would be somewhere in between 1917 and 1950, a long stretch, and the time at which it ended, which would be a shorter stretch, like 1989 to 91 or something like that. That was the Cold War. That's my Cold War. That's the Cold War that I own, so to speak, or like to think of myself as owning. There are other Cold Wars, however, have been other Cold Wars in history, long rivalries that have not produced hot wars. So the classic example is the British-Russian Great Game in Asia in the 19th century. But there are plenty of others, and one that's often forgotten is the Anglo-American relationship, which produced two wars between 1775 and 1812. But then for the next century, despite the fact that the Americans were a rising power, posing a lethal threat to a very large Canadian dominion, Canada, and building a big navy and all of these things that the Brits should have been upset about. They weren't upset. And in fact, they opened the door for the Americans. Just it was a policy of appeasing the Americans prior to World War I, because the Brits were more worried about Germany than they were America. And so a distinction was made in that case. And that's an underwritten history looking at that in that particular way. So I don't think rivalries should be thought of as always becoming major, dangerous Cold Wars. Rivalries are inherent in international relations, and coldness is inherent in international relations. Nobody ever said international relations were all warm and fuzzy, and they're not. So that's my sense on it. I really would like to, if possible, restrict the use of Cold War to the one with capital letters, but that's a lost cause.
And Professor, following on the China front, I believe Manas has a question related.
Okay.
Yeah, Professor Gaddis, I think there's very few, bipartisan foreign policy issues in the United States because of, how polarized things are right now. But I think one of the few ones is being hawkish on China to some degree. And I'm just wondering, as kind of the Asia Pacific region becomes more dominant economically and politically, when we look back on this era in 20, 30, 50 years, how are we going to think about this hawkishness on China?
I think we're likely to say it's China's fault, because China has been hawkish toward everybody inside, it seems to me. Wolfish, in fact, if you look at wolf warrior diplomacy, the Chinese strategy under Xi in recent years seems to be to frighten everybody, to alienate everybody. And if not alienate everybody, then buy the weaker powers off and then throw them into debt, which is happening with so many third world countries in the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. It's quite amazing that China has gone back to this view of seeing itself as the center of the world, to which everybody has got to kowtow. And if you go around the borders of China, they have just about alienated everybody that you can look at, except in public, the Russians. They have kept that relationship on the surface fairly amicable. It's not going to stay that way, though. There is a long history of Russian-Chinese suspicion, antagonism, not least because of the emptiness of Siberia and the population of China and the claims that China has made on Russian territory over many centuries. So even that rivalry, I think, is likely to resurface in some form. So it's an extraordinary strategy that she is following, enemies in all directions, enemies on all sides. A couple of people have followed it in the past with some success. One was Charles de Gaulle in France, who was pretty good at this. And another, actually, interestingly, was Mao Zedong, who in the period before the Cultural Revolution was avidly just cultivating, making enemies in all directions. But that was for the purpose of consolidating his power at home. And of course, once he'd done that through a very chaotic process, the Cultural Revolution and whatnot, he jumped at the opportunity to form a relationship with the US to counterbalance the Russians, you see, and back to power politics and so on. So I don't think she is pointing in that direction. I don't see many signs that she is looking to align, for example, with the Americans against the Russians, or with the Russians, maybe more likely with the Russians against the Americans. But even there, what does that give you? Russia has, about the clout of I don't know, Chile or something these days. It's not what it used to be. I am puzzled by this. And I think the only way to explain it is that it comes from deeply rooted Chinese cultural characteristics. It comes from a far more gripping sense of history than we have, at least we Americans. It comes from very long memories on the part of the Chinese. It seems to me strange that they aren't asking, where does all of this lead? What is supposed to be the result of it? The other thing that is relevant here is the abolition of term limits in China. Does President Xi really believe that he's going to be increasingly wise as he gets increasingly old? Very few old people become increasingly wise with the passage of the years, just the opposite. That's going to be a problem for Xi, as it will be for Putin as well. And that's really an Achilles heel, so to speak, for both the Russian and the Chinese systems, ultimately, over the long term. The real issue is, how do you get to long term, and how do you manage crises and keep them from blowing up into something like 1914, sleepwalking into war? And that's the issue that has to preoccupy us now.
Thank you very, very much, Professor. We've got 6 minutes, so Rory has a quick question, and then we've got, I think, one more.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Professor Gaddis, for your talk. It was very interesting. And one thing you mentioned is how incredibly polarized politics is in the United States. But given the pandemic represents one of the biggest, if not is the biggest public health challenge in over a century, why do you think measures such as social distancing, mask wearing are such political issues that divide down party lines? Because if you compare to, for example, the United Kingdom and European countries, the social distancing measures haven't really been a hot political issue. So why do you think that is the case in the United States?
Well, I think it's spotty all over the world. Look at Brazil, for example, where it's even worse, this situation. So it's inconsistent, but there's no question that, yeah, it's been turned into a political issue in this country. I think with the increasing evidence of efficiency of vaccination, there's a story out just this morning on the wires that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, I guess, have an extremely and unexpectedly good antivirus rate. And I think as the evidence mounts on this, that issue will begin to go away, and people will mask. The other thing that's happening is, of course, that as we make progress with the vaccines, there's less need for it. So one of the things that's beginning to happen, for example, in our state, in Connecticut, is that the guidance has been given that some of the mask regulations can be relaxed now with certain people if they have vaccinations. So we have had our first visitor in the house for a year who, without a mask, who happens to be Professor Paul Kennedy, who just lives across the back fence from me. And Paul has been over a couple of times, without a mask. And so far, we're still alive. So I think that'll work. We both had our shots and all that. So it's going to work in that way too. It's never going to be perfect. But I think the lessons are out there. And I don't look for this to increase significantly.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor. And if it's okay, I'll take the last 4 minutes to put one final question on. You mentioned the abolition of term limits and then Putin. And I think over Trump's 4 years, there was talk of, whether he was after Helsinki in 2018, whether he'd been compromised by whatever they had on him allegedly. And whether, there's already been some obviously significant developments since January under Biden, but whether there will be, again, a seismic shift in how Biden, responds to Russia, given, under the Obama administration, you had Georgia, Ukraine, and other events that seem to have gone, not necessarily unpunished, but they seem to have got away with, to put it succinctly. So I wondered your thoughts on Russia-US relations over the next 4 years or however long.
Well, what I fear, Mitch, is that Democrats are still carrying on their back the burden of having lost China some 70 years ago. And therefore the inability to compromise, the inability to cut deals with authoritarians. So that was very deleterious in the Vietnam War, when Johnson felt that he had to stick it out because he could not be seen to be weak, despite the fact that we were expending massive resources on a country whose insignificance to American security could not have been greater. In that situation, we got into complete rigidity analogous only to the Athenians' Sicilian expedition in the Peloponnesian War. And that was because of a credibility problem, the fear of appearing weak. What I'm concerned about is that there may still be leftover tendencies of this in the Biden administration, and that they would not have the self-confidence to do what Trump and Republicans have traditionally done in situations like that, and that's go and negotiate with the bad guys. So Nixon set the precedent, of course, by going to Beijing and got away with it and was cheered for it and so on. Trump defused North Korea for at least a year or so by going off and having his lovely relationship with Kim Jong-un, which did not solve any problems, but at the same time, it defused the tensions that were there. Trump could meet with Putin, suspicions would be aroused. Probably more suspicions would be aroused if Biden did it at this point. I don't think it helps for Biden to be calling Putin a killer, despite the fact that he is. I don't think you say that about other heads of state and so on. So I fear that the Democrats are still laboring under this old thing where they have to demonstrate their credibility as tough guys. And that part of it, I don't like. It seems to me that diplomacy should always be open to pursuing opportunistic avenues for lowering tension, because obviously everybody has an interest in nobody has an interest in a great world war. Nobody ever has, really. And so that's my concern for the future with the Democrats. Otherwise, I'm quite happy with what's going on, and I'm impressed with the personnel in the Biden administration. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has actually been a professor in our grand strategy program at Yale. So I know him quite well and respect him a great deal. And so I'm a lot happier about that return to professionalism in the Biden administration. I just worry that professionals sometimes get bogged down in the weeds and can't see the forest, And that, together with the credibility issue, is something to be concerned about.
Well, perfect. And that's really excellent timing, bang on the hour. So thank you very much, Professor. And thank you everyone else for coming. I hope you enjoyed Professor Gaddis's thoughts and analysis, and I'm sure there's plenty of food for thought. So thank you all for coming. And thank you once again, Professor.
Yeah. Thanks to all. Thanks, Mitch, for setting it up. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Mhm.